thanks so much to the organizers for the opportunity to present. Just to introduce myself a bit for those who don't know me, I got my PhD 2014. I've worked in the policy and the private sector for a little while, but have now recommitted myself to scholarly pursuits in the research group of the World Bank. And this is a chapter from my dissertation, actually, that I'm very happy to sort of share around finally. You know, we're going to talk about today about industrial policy, but specifically industrial policy that focuses on specific locations in a country. And there are two broad perspectives in the literature on this. I think the first is summarized by the sort of recent Good Economics for Hard Times by Banerjee and DeVlow, which says that, well, you know, if labor is somehow sticky and can't move across locations, we may actually want to subsidize locations that have adverse shocks or are just unproductive. And then, you know, there's a sort of different literature which says, well, no, if we assume that people can move around, what we want to do is target places with larger scale elasticities, or, you know, with some mobility frictions, more elastic labor supply. And the idea there is that, you know, you can achieve scale more quickly with subsidies, potentially, from the competitive distribution of economic activity across space. But the challenge in this literature is that it's sort of focused a lot on, you know, trying to measure whether, you know, agglomeration elasticities are different in different locations, and, you know, they have various IV approaches, which are always very noisy and kind of lead to this conservative conclusion that, well, you know, we can't really know whether these scale elasticities are different in different locations. And so that's led to sort of a bias, I think, against, or not a bias, but a conclusion against place-based policy. So what am I going to do in this paper? I'm going to introduce a quantitative model that allows you to consider both the distributional and efficiency implications of moving capital around. And I'm also going to, it's going to yield a new estimation approach that's going to allow me to test basically whether the competitive allocation is efficient, and then whether there's a case for subsidizing investment in particular places. And then we'll be able to actually quantify sort of what the costs and benefits of that is. So, you know, just to take you through that, I'll go through sort of three pieces. First is theory. I'm calling it the spatial Lewis model of regional development, which should be, you know, hopefully interesting to this particular group. I'll talk through why I call it that in a second. The empirics then, you know, you're going to be able to talk about welfare in this model using a few sufficient statistics that we estimate just from labor demand and capital demand and the wage bill. So that's sort of a, you know, a general data set that you have in many contexts. We're going to look at India. And then I'm also going to use the industrial licensing reform as a sort of quasi-experimental shock to the price of capital. And this has been studied before, but not looking at the kind of regional or the sort of the district level impacts, which we have new data on in this paper. And then the results, you know, just as a preview, will say that, you know, the elasticities that we estimate are consistent with actually greater scale economies in rural areas. And the idea here is going to be that, you know, in a rural area, if you put a unit of capital or you change the price of investment, you can draw in a lot more labor quickly because of sort of more elastic labor supply. This is kind of the Lewis idea of, you know, unlimited, maybe not quite unlimited, but certainly more elastic labor supply allows you to achieve scale more quickly. But I'm going to be agnostic on sort of where that comes from. But we do see the elasticity. And then, but the sort of counterpoint to that is that nonetheless, if you know, even if you do you can have gains from subsidizing investment in rural areas. There are also costs of taxing investment in urban areas, and so how you finance this sort of tax and subsidy regime, you know, can you know, still create net losses. Okay, just to summarize, this is the basic idea is just, should we change the price of capital across regions in a country? And we're going to try to estimate, you know, what the effects of that is. Just a bit on the literature here. So place-based policy, there's sort of a lot of work in the United States using a sort of single factor model with just labor. I think what we're concerned with here is that many countries do subsidize investment specifically in regions, so try to generate more investment, and that's going to, by looking at the capital, it's going to be a way to understand what the sort of dynamic implications of this are. And in a developing country, which we study, India, that's all the more important because you're trying to accumulate capital rapidly. I think, as I mentioned, there's this sort of test for external sale economies. We're going to do that using factor demand, and I'll talk about this, but the tax that we look at is kind of a wedge in the sense of Shane Klenow, and I'll be more specific about that. And then this is also relevant to a literature on the labor market effects of domestic reforms. So in India, a lot a lot of focus has been made on sort of the effects of trade liberalization. Here we're looking at an instance of sort of reform of restraints on the domestic economy and what the implications there are for that, and specifically at the district or the very local level. Okay, here's the outline. So to begin the model, there's sort of three main features. There are three main features. Workers in the region choose between an informal enterprise or a formal enterprise. They can also choose, we'll let them have industry-specific skills. Everything's going to be analyzed sort of at an industry region level. So so we basically need factor shares to be constant at that level in the analysis. So workers they have two choices, right? They choose between a region using this sort of discrete choice problem that you've seen before in some of the spatial econometrics, spatial equilibrium literature. And then once they're in a region, they choose between a formal and an informal enterprise. And that's going to basically the quantity of, or the volume of outside opportunities in the informal sector is going to cause variation in the labor supply curve to the formal sector. In the second point is that capital is going to face region-specific taxes, and then it's only in the formal sector where capital is combined with labor. So this is the idea of Lewis. It's labor is fructified with capital, and so as a result, the allocation of capital is going to determine the level of formal employment in a region, and that's also going to summarize the overall level of welfare. So you're better off when you have more employment in the formal sector because you have access to capital and this sort of some returns to scale. There will also be a constant external scale elasticity, and this is similar to this kind of agglomeration economies in the urban literature. But importantly, even if that elasticity is constant across space, variation in the labor supply curve can still sort of make a case for subsidizing investment in particular locations. So here's just that in mathematics. The labor, the utility of the worker is their choice. They get an amenity from being in a specific location, which is not observed, and then they have their expected wage. So either if they work in the formal sector, that's the second term, they get the wage rate in the formal sector. If they stay in the informal sector, they get their profits that they draw from this distribution of being in the informal sector, which is Pareto. And the idea again here is that so that Pareto distribution of opportunities is concave, and so the wage is actually convex in the level of formal employment in the area. So as there's more formal employment, the wage rises faster and faster. Formal sector is just going to be standard Cobb-Douglas, but then we allow for these external economies of scale, as in the urban literature. And so just to be very clear on the tax on capital, every firm is going to face a sort of district-specific tax on the marginal product of capital, and then sets that equal to a constant return. Capital is assumed to be mobile across regions, and you can rearrange that to get the wedge, as in Shea and Kleinow. And again, because of these potential externalities, you can have taxes that are welfare enhancing, or subsidies, let's say. So here's the first welfare result, which is that, and I want you to think of, I think normally, and in the exposition I showed you, that people could choose between regions, but often policymakers thinking about place-based policies don't think that. They think that people are stuck in a particular region. And so I want to define an equilibrium where we start with that assumption and see what a government would be motivated to do if it made those assumptions. And so here we say, assume that the population is fixed, assume that they're fixed productivity levels, not productivity levels that are in addition to the potential economies of scale. Here the spatial equilibrium is basically an allocation of capital across regions, a rate of return, and then a level of formal sector employment such that the workers choose between formal and informal, and that the formal sector firms maximize profits and prices. And sort of a very nice result here is that, well, if this equilibrium can be inefficient if the elasticity of the wage rate with respect to the price of capital is not constant across regions. So it's a social optimum only if this thing is constant. And so what this means is that a government, that even if it believes people are fixed, can, if it can estimate that elasticity, it knows and it can test whether it should change taxes across regions. And so we're going to be able to estimate that elasticity, see whether the government, with this assumption, would want to intervene, and then we'll be able to measure the quantitative impact of that policy. I'm just checking my time. Great. So what I want to take you through now is just the results of the model. I hope the assumptions are clear, and just show you the welfare analysis that the model yields. So it allows you to summarize quantitatively the benefits and costs of a particular tax. So the sort of marginal effect of a tax on the welfare of workers in a particular region is just defined by two terms. So this first term in the thing, which has this gamma W times K, is basically saying that the workers in the region, their welfare is summarized by the capital stock, right? Because the capital made them more productive. And then also how much their wage changes with respect to the tax. So that's the first effect of kind of the benefit for people living in the region. And then the second term is allowing for migration. And what that basically says is that the gains from the effect of the tax are also shared with people that don't live in the region and are sort of on the margin from migrating from other locations. So 1 minus n is the share of people living in the region that we're looking at, and 1 minus n is the rest of the population. And this just comes from the independence of irrelevant alternatives property of this discrete choice sort of conditional logit framework that we have. And so what you've seen here is that all we need to know how labor is affected by this tax is just the elasticity of the wage with respect to the price of capital. And this is this gamma, what I call gamma W. There's nothing that makes this fixed across locations. There could be different scale elasticities. If I go back to this omega the agglomeration elasticity, that omega term, the slope of this, of the outside options could also affect that elasticity. So in estimation, we're going to let it be very flexible. I'll say one more thing. Well, no, let me actually just move on until capital. I'll come back to it. So the next question is, what are the welfare effects on owners of capital? And here, again, we have two main terms. So I'll show you these two. There's these two elasticities. So gamma K is just how much the capital stock responds to the tax, and then gamma R is how much the equilibrium price of capital changes with respect to the tax. So that's a general equilibrium price on the effect on the price of capital. So these are two elasticities which we can estimate, and then we understand, how does the welfare of capital change? Well, there's some change in the amount of capital in the region, but then also the returns to that capital will change, and that's summarized by the first term. Now, there's a question of whether, so just to go back here, the elasticity of capital with respect to the price of capital, we're going to estimate directly just from a capital demand function. But this general equilibrium effect is harder to understand because we don't necessarily observe the price of capital. So how are we going to get it? It turns out that given the structure of the model, you can actually infer the price of capital by looking at how both labor and capital adjust, and then calibrating specific parameters for the labor share and this external scale elasticity. So, in the first term, this is just sort of a comparative static from the price equal to marginal product to capital equation. If the sort of labor to capital ratio increases, we infer that there's some change in the price of capital. And then we also learn something about, we also sort of adjust for the fact that there may be scale effects driving that as well. What we have, let me see, so to summarize this, there are three key elasticities that we need to estimate that will allow us to do welfare analysis in the model. The first is the elasticity of the wage with respect to the price of capital. The second is the elasticity of the capital stock with respect to the price of the capital. And third is the elasticity of the labor utilized with respect to the price of capital. The way I'm going to do this is, instead of trying to estimate these the omegas and the etas, which is very fraught exercise, I'm just going to calibrate them to a range of parameters and show you what the conclusions are. Okay, so now we're going to take this to the empirics. So there's two fundamental problems here. So the first is that we need exogenous variation in the price of capital. This could be potentially very problematic, because if you think that governments are subsidizing places with lower productivity, for example, there'll be all sorts of correlation with economic activity and the price of capital firms face. And the second thing, which is a sort of more general problem that's been faced in the macro literature on misallocation, is that this tau is unobserved. It's you have to infer it from firms' decisions. We don't, at least in the context of it, especially in the context of a developing country where taxes can be implicit through regulation, for example. We're not going to observe this directly. So what's our solution? We're going to look at the factor demand response to a reform that is isomorphic to changing tau. So what do? We're going to revisit this industrial licensing reform, which was studied by Aguillon and co-authors. So in India, pre-1985, firms had to get a license to open plants or expand capacity. And there's a literature, this haven't been emphasized as much, but the policy was actually to make this constraint more binding in urban areas as an attempt to restrict investment there and divert capital to rural areas or backwards areas, as they called it, and this was in pursuit of what they called regional balance. At the same time, there were also subsidies available for investment in rural areas, which were taken up. And what you can think about is that this tax, the tax that we have in the model is just equivalent to a legislative cap on investment that fixes the difference between a marginal product of capital and its cost. So there's this kind of parallel. There's a parallel between the tax, in a Shane-Klenow sense, and this cap on capital. So what we're going to do is observe, well, what happens in different districts of different levels of development when this cap is removed, and we're going to use that to infer the elasticities in the model. Here's the data set. So what we've done is we use the annual survey of industries in India, which is a well-known repeated cross-section of manufacturing plants. What's unique about this paper is that I spent some time in the statistical archives, the National Statistical Office in Calcutta, and I got the district identifiers for the survey and was able to map the establishments to districts in India. In most regions, there's some missing, but we have six of the five of the main, no, six of the 7 largest cities here. Each of the green areas is basically a grouping of districts that is continuous over the time of the sample. So it's a fixed region, but we're able to have we have rich data on the characteristics of each one of those regions. So we're able to look at a much more finely grained geography than in past analyses of this reform. So let me just show you the basic effects. So this is a difference in difference specification. On the left-hand side, you have different variables observed at the industry district level. The delicensed dummy is just a dummy for whether the industry has been, the reform has happened and the restrictions on investment have been removed. And then the second term is an interaction between that dummy and the level of urbanization, the share of the population living in an urban area in that district or region. And what you see is that the effects or the growth in real terms was, well, you can think of this as a reallocation of both the wage bill and the capital stock and plants to more urban areas. So there was more growth in urban areas. In the bottom rows, you can see this in percentage terms, that there was because the base was already a bit larger in the fourth quartiles or the most urbanized places. In percentage terms, that was a bit smaller, though still significant. And actually, in the places that were least urbanized, you see actually a decline in employment and capital stock. So there really was disinvestment, or let's say allowing for depreciation in the rural areas, and an acceleration of investment and hiring in the most urbanized areas of the country. This is just a way to see this graphically in terms of the capital stock. So in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that after the blue line is the density distribution after the reform. So it actually moved to the left. So this capital stock in most regions is falling in that quartile. And then in the fourth, in the lower right-hand corner, you can see that it's moved slightly to the right. So I'm calling this a reallocation of capital. from less urbanized areas to more urbanized areas. So now, how can we use this policy shock? Some questions. Yes, Tommaso, Tommaso, sorry, yes, it is the ASI, yeah. But
sorry,
as I said,
can I follow up?
Sure, yeah.
Do you have the results also for the NSS? For the smaller firms?
No, so this is important. So the NSS looks, which is the National Sample Survey, also looks at informal sector. But in our model, you don't need the informal sector to summarize welfare because people are choosing between work and the informal places. So it's sort of a feature of the analytic framework. But no. So let's go down to the empirics. So what we're going to do is we're going to again try to. The idea is just that the response to this to this shock, in response to this shock, firms are going to be maximizing profits, and so aggregate wage bill, labor, and capital are going to shift as a result of those decisions. And so we're going to estimate sort of three seemingly unrelated regressions: the wage bill log of the wage bill, log of the labor employed, and log of the capital stock on this industry shock. We're also going to interact it with some X variables that allow for variation across regions to basically give you the regional variation. And then there's some algebra which we go through in the paper, which showed that basically you can back out the key sufficient statistics, these three elasticities of wage, capital, and labor, from these equations. And the idea here is that so look at the denominator in these three identities. That's just the difference between the wage bill and the capital stock. By comparing the change in those two variables, you infer how much the price of capital changed with respect to the because of the shock. So these elasticities give us how much these three things changed with respect to the change in the price of capital that was induced by the reform. So the reform can be thought of as changing the price of capital, and we're learning about that from the equation. We just use minimum distance to impose these restrictions, and the delta method for standard errors. What is the X? So we need variation across space. To do this, we're going to use, thanks, Ezra, I've got the time. So we need, because it's an industry level reform, we need some variation across space and interaction effect. I'm going to use just the baseline taxes that we calculate from the ratio of the wage bill and the capital stock, with some assumptions, with some assumption on the, let me say, data on the labor share, these ADAs, and then I'm just going to allow the X to be quartiles of this variable. I will say that I'm looking at other ways to do this. It seems like it may be a bit fragile, or this seems, but it's actually not. If you look at sort of above and below median, the results are very similar. And if you use combinations of the other the variables, the other covariates at the regional level, the results are similar. So let me just show you this. So this is, I've calculated this implicit price of capital, and I'm now just regressing it on different regional covariates in the data to show you, well, before the reform, where was capital more or less expensive? And these results are broadly consistent with the sort of intentions of the government around subsidies for particular areas. I think to note, so more urbanized places right here see higher prices of capital, and places which are classified as backwards see lower prices of capital. So this is consistent with the subsidies for redistribution. And interestingly, you find in the 9th column that sort of more votes for the ruling political party, the Indian National Congress, are also consistent with lower price of capital. So this is consistent with some political processes shaping pricing of capital across space. So here are the key elasticities. So I want you to focus on the first column, which is the elasticity of the wage with respect to the price of capital. So remember, I said that if you think everybody's fixed in a region, you want to equalize this across space. And so if there are differences, that is actually a positive argument, or the normative argument for the government to shape the price of capital such that these things equalize. And again, in what we find is that they are actually different. So in above median urbanization areas, you see this number is 0.01, sort of quite small. So if you change the price of capital, not much happens to the wage. Whereas in the below median urbanization areas, it's much more sensitive. So that's negative. So if you raise the price of capital, the wage is going to fall by 0.19%, 0.19. And if you decrease the price of capital, it will raise wages by a commensurate amount. And the difference between those is statistically significant. So if you go back to our proposition, we say that, wow, this is a situation where the government, if it believed that people were fixed, it would want to actually change prices of capital across regions. I'm going to show, I'll just say that the patterns are sort of similar, and as you would expect for the other ones. I want to keep going for lack of time. So this is the rate of return effect. So this is 1 plus the effect of the tax on the return to capital, which again, I said I'd calibrated for different factor shares and agglomeration elasticities. The main takeaway from here is that this term is always less than 1. So that means that when you change the price of capital, increase the price of capital, the return is falling. So which is what you would expect with some sort of diminishing returns. Here's the final analysis. So this summarizes everything. So you can break down. So what I've done is in the rows you have the different elements of the change of welfare. So the first 2 rows are the effects on the welfare of labor. The second 2 rows are the effects on the welfare of capital, and then we can add them together. As I said, the labor effect is broken up into existing workers and marginal migrants. The capital reallocation, the capital effect is broken up into the change in the capital stock, and then this rate of return effect. And so the policy that we simulate in this table is I've broken the regions up into what I call rural, which are below median urbanization, and those which are above median urbanization, which I call urban. And then I say, let's have a marginal subsidy. So we make the price of capital a little bit cheaper. Basically, you multiply all those marginal effects by -1. And then in the tax, in the urban area, you multiply them by +1. There's the price is going up a little bit, right? What you see is, I think, pretty interesting. So if you compare columns 1 and 2 in the existing worker effect, the worker welfare, you actually see that the reallocation of capital caused net benefits to workers that outweighed the costs in the urban areas. So and this is because the wages are much more sensitive to the subsidy in the rural areas. However, when you look at capital, the tax in the urban area is sort of destroys more capital than is brought to the rural areas, and that's because there's the capital stock is much larger in the urban areas, so it's much more costly to constrain investment in these places. And looking finally at the general equilibrium effects, you see that those sort of attenuate slightly the effects of moving capital around. So since we're bringing capital into the rural areas with the subsidy, that created some gain, but then because the marginal product of capital falls a little bit when there's more capital, it decreases a bit. Similarly, the rate of return increases a bit when you move capital away from the urban areas. And so overall in the analysis, we see that just treating workers and capitalists equally, while the policy created a larger proportional benefit to the guys in the rural areas, the net benefit was negative because of the capital that was taken away in the urban areas. And so just to summarize, I've given you a tractable framework to look at redistribution. We see that there was a case, maybe from the government's perspective, to redistribute capital, and in fact, sort of net benefits for workers were greater by subsidizing investment in less urbanized areas. But taxing capital has this cost. And so in India, the policy of trying to move capital from tax capital in cities and subsidize it in rural areas was ultimately a net negative. And the policy takeaway for a general audience, general context, is that there may be a case for subsidizing investment in rural areas, but you have to look carefully at how those are funded. So if those are funded by very costly taxes on capital in rural areas, it still may not be worth it. And that's a sort of general issue with tax analysis. Okay, great. Let me turn to questions. Thanks so much for your time. Great, Hannes? I'm not sure.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for the presentation. So I just wanted to think a little bit about like the sort of modeling choice underlying the exercise, where the vision of the world here is that the key sort of inefficiency is that there's increasing returns of production in the formal sector. The size of the formal sector is determined by capital, and therefore like the allocation of capital is the central part of the economy. I'm just trying to think a little bit like why you want to make that choice, and like whether you would like sort of follow through on that, because I think it's very true that it's like a very Lewis style model. And of course, what comes out of your model, I would guess, is that you should just tax the informal sector and give money to the capitalists in every region. And that was tried. I mean, Robert Bates wrote a book about like how they tried to do that in Africa with marketing boards and so on, getting the returns to scale in the urban sector. And people in general, for good or for bad reasons, have not been that happy with how that thing turned out. So I just want to sort of think like, is there a particular reason why you want to resurrect this, or should we think about it more as a metaphor for other things? So I'm just a bit interested in that.
Well, I mean, I think that we agree that capital accumulation is an important part of growth. Yep. Some technology may even be embodied in capital, so it's more than you see in growth accounting. So I think that was how I was thinking about it. I will say that so two points. One is that this paper is designed to address a very specific policy question, which is, should you and what are the effects of affecting taxes on capital in different regions. And if you look, this is very common in the European Union. In the United States, there's advantageous tax treatment, for example, for private equity firms that invest in less urbanized areas. So this is a policy which is used. I think and I sort of, this was a little bit my response to Tommaso's point, which is that I think by modeling a choice between informal and formal employment, you get this nice feature, which is that the development of the formal sector is sufficient for welfare analysis. And I think that's useful because you often don't have data on the informal sector, especially the capital stock that's there in many environments. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that there are not other theories of development other than capital accumulation, but I think it's still very important.
Or I guess it could be other models as well of why we would like to allocate capital there. Not necessarily to exploit economies of scale, but maybe just like as a backhand way of redistributing income, like by increasing wages if we don't want to do it by taxes. So that's also
exactly, yeah. So that's I didn't focus on that in the paper, but yes, you could add some Pareto weights and
exactly, yeah. So that would be like my other model. Like you have different Pareto weights, and this is like a good way of redistributing rather than like assuming it would be efficient. Maybe it's like, I wouldn't say it's clearly not efficient, but maybe it's not efficient, but the point was never to be efficient at like money weights. The point was to be efficient at Pareto weights or something like that.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to do here also is sort of, I think a lot of the literature, Banerjee and Duflo make this point that a lot of the literature has assumed, people can migrate very easily, but that's not something that policymakers often assume. So I wanted to see what, could you get them to, could you give them a framework for policy without that assumption and see what it would provide. Tommaso.
Yeah.
I
by the way,
I
I
only
think
called on
panelists
you
cannot
because
raise
I
their
could see
hand.
you. I could physically see your hand. Yeah.
That's why I raise it like this, because panelists cannot raise it like with the comment. Anyway, no. So like back to kind of what we were saying before the ASI, and also like related to Hannes' comment, I think it would be useful to look at NSS data as well. So something which at least surprised me when I look at the NSS and ASI together, it is that there is like a lot of overlap. I don't know if within region it's true, but at least like overall there is like, of course the NSS has like productivity distribution shifted to the like whatever the bad side, the left, but there is a lot of overlap. So it would be useful to kind of like validate a little bit your model and I don't know, just kind of bring that piece of evidence into it. Because if I understand correctly, like in your model there is like more of a clear ordering. So I like the feature that you don't need data on the informal sector, but maybe if you can like validate it, the prediction of your model with data on the informal sector, that would be like build confidence that actually this is a good model, and so partial answer to Hannes as well.
No, that's a great point. Thank you.
Is there a question by Rocco?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks, Tristan. This is maybe unrelated. I was also thinking, though, that in a country like India in general, we don't think that the capital markets work very well, and say because of all sorts of contracting problems. And if we think that the bulk of available collateral, essentially to borrow, is available in urban area, could that also give a reason for why you might want to push capital in the rural areas? Because it's very hard to borrow there because of absence of good collateral, essentially. So there could be a pure efficiency reason for why you might want to direct capital over there, and then in that might actually be a good idea.
Yeah. So two points on that. So one, you're absolutely right. So in this framework, differences in the price of capital across locations, which could come from some exogenous source, might generate variation in this wage elasticity, and that would give you a case for intervention. So I haven't said where these distortions come from. The capital or collateral constraints could be one. I think a second point, which is interesting, is that, so remember I showed you that you could estimate the general equilibrium effect of the tax on the return to capital by looking at just how the the labor and capital respond to the tax, those two elasticities. When I estimate those, you know, in the rural and the urban areas, I actually find that the implied effect of the tax on the rate of return to capital is similar. And so I interpreted this as actually some evidence that the capital markets are a little bit, well, let's say more well integrated than you might think, because they sort of exhibit similar sensitivities. So that's just a point there.
Hey, one question, Tristan. I want to get back to Tommaso's point.
Yeah.
You say that you make assumptions in the model so that looking at a partial subset of economies is enough. Can you spell out those assumptions, and can you tell us more when will that be broken and you will need more information? Yeah,
so the idea, it's sort of an envelope theorem type of argument. So it's just that the workers are marginally choosing between the formal and informal sector, and so you can, any marginal effect of the you know, on the wage, let's say, is just going to be the effect on the people that are in the formal sector. So that's the basic argument.
When it's broke, when that envelope theorem is broken, then that shouldn't be enough.
Yeah. So if there are, I guess if there's a large mass of people that can't move to the, if there's actually a barrier in terms of moving between those sectors, then I think that's an issue. But it might just show up in the curvature of the supply of labor to the formal sector. So I guess it's sort of how you interpret it. I don't know. Do you have a specific hypothesis, or?
I guess oftentimes surveillance statistics hide some underlying.
Yeah.
Well, not hide. It relies on underlying assumptions that you might or might not want to.
Right. So it's all
to assume and
yeah. So it's these are marginal effects that I look at, and so if you wanted to observe, you know, the full,
even for marginal effects might not work.
Yeah.
And I wanted to understand the deviation that you may want to entertain or not. I mean, I don't have an obvious. I guess obviously, if informals and formal sectors, like you said, are more decoupled, then you may need to know more.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if yeah, I'm not sure. I think there's a barrier between the two. I think if there are some economies of scale in the informal sector, then that would be an issue, because you would miss some gains from that part, you know, which may exist from Tommaso's work on the informal carpenters.
Cool.
I think Eric has a question.
Yeah, there are a few.
Hello. Okay, I'm muted. Oh, there I am. Okay, sorry. Just a quick question, just to make sure I've understood. It seems like here, like the policy case is really just to undo existing distortions, right? If I understood correctly, like if it's just laissez-faire and there were no distortions, then capital would flow where we want it to flow. And so it seems like a fairly sort of weak case for place-based policies or something that's true. I mean, it may be that there are such distortions, but we sort of don't observe them, and we have to infer them from the fact that return to capital is low. And so, I don't know. I guess I would have thought there might have been a stronger case for subsidizing particular regions than just that. Yeah.
No. Sorry. So there are two reasons why you would want to why the competitive equilibrium isn't efficient. The first would be, and then this is in addition to, don't worry about migration frictions. There would be variation in this agglomeration scale economy across space. So that's kind of the classic one from Glaser-Gottlieb, which just says that your ability to achieve economies of scale is different in different regions, and so because the marginal product of capital is because equalizing the marginal product of capital determines the allocation of capital, it's not going to pick up variation in those different scale economies. And then the second is variation in the labor supply curve. So, again, this you don't have to think of this as a distortion. It just could be that in certain places, people have more, better outside options in the informal sector due to underlying productivity. I'm not saying where those are coming from. So, there's lots of reasons why, the two main reasons why the equilibrium could be inefficient. So I hope that clarifies it, Eric.
Tristan, can I ask a clarifying question about your TAUs? I didn't follow everything exactly, but is the TAUs measuring the distortion on capital, the cost of capital overall, or just the government imposed distortion on capital?
Sorry, could you say that again?
The TAUs, the price of capital. Does that measure the price of capital overall, or is it just the government imposed distortion on capital?
So it's the price of capital overall. So it's a difference from the average price, but I'm saying that a government would be attempting to moderate that in a.
Because what's unusual there is that the government sort of like you showed them regressed on the observables, and the government, I guess. The government is sort of like overcompensating for what the natural thing would be. Like you would imagine capital would be cheapest near a port and not inland. So that is a reason for the government to potentially want to redistribute inland, I guess. But they're overdoing it so that it's like it's actually cheaper inland. Is that right? I mean, those were the kind of things that I was seeing.
Yeah. No, that's right. So again, I don't, I'm not taking a stand on what the price of capital, should be. As Rocco pointed out, there are many distortions. As you pointed out, it could be varying across land. But the government has in India has taken this the policy of saying we want capital to be more available in a particular set of locations. I guess I've been agnostic about what that is, what that policy is relative to the.
Yeah, I guess it's just a super effective policy is the point in terms of it's super effective in changing the price of capital. So the effective price.
Yes, and I think this was basically a controlled economy at the time, so that's perhaps not surprising.